The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the Riverside Manor, as Marcus's words echoed through the elegant ballroom. Rachel and I are getting divorced. Kimberly and I are moving in together. The laughter and congratulations from our 8th anniversary celebration died instantly, replaced by a silence so thick you could practically taste the shock hanging in the air. I stood there in my emerald green dress, the one Marcus had picked out himself just 2 weeks ago, watching my husband of 8 years announce our marriage's end to a room full of friends, family, and colleagues, while his arm wrapped possessively around the waist of Kimberly Hayes, the social worker who had been helping us navigate what I thought were temporary marital counseling sessions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening had started so differently. I had spent 3 weeks planning this anniversary party, believing we were celebrating not just 8 years of marriage, but our successful journey through couples therapy. The Riverside Manor's ballroom sparkled with fairy lights and white roses. Marcus's favorite jazz quartet played softly in the corner, and I had personally selected every appetizer, every wine pairing, every detail to make this night perfect. The guest list included everyone who mattered to us: my sister Nicole, Marcus's business partner Derek Walsh, our neighbors Patricia and Robert, and dozens of friends who had supported us through what I believed were just growing pains in our relationship. I had even worn the emerald dress because Marcus had specifically requested it during one of our shopping trips last month. "Green brings out your eyes, Rachel," he had said, kissing my forehead in the department store. "You should wear it to something special." Now I realized he wanted me to look beautiful for my own public humiliation, like some twisted form of ceremony where the sacrificial lamb gets dressed up before the slaughter. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kimberly Hayes stood beside him in a conservative black dress that screamed professional distance, her blonde hair pulled back in the same severe bun she wore to all our therapy sessions. This was the woman who had sat across from us in her sterile office for 6 months, asking probing questions about our communication patterns and intimacy levels, all while apparently conducting her own private sessions with my husband behind my back. Marcus cleared his throat, that same nervous gesture he made before delivering bad news about his construction projects or explaining why he'd be working late again. "I know this is unexpected," he continued, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd with an authority that made my skin crawl. "But Kimberly has helped me realize that Rachel and I have grown apart beyond repair. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is admit when something isn't working." The clinical language, the therapeutic buzzwords, the way he spoke about our marriage, like it was a failed business venture rather than 8 years of shared dreams, inside jokes, late-night conversations, and the thousand small intimacies that make up a life together. I could see our friends exchanging glances, unsure whether to congratulate him or comfort me. Linda Chen, my college roommate and maid of honor, had her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. Derek Walsh looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, probably calculating how this personal drama would affect their business partnership. But it was my sister Nicole's face that broke my heart. She had flown in from Seattle specifically for this party, had helped me pick out decorations and plan the menu, had been so excited to celebrate what she called our comeback story after the rough patch we'd supposedly weathered through therapy. Now she stood frozen by the dessert table, her eyes filled with a combination of rage and protective fury that I knew meant she was already planning Marcus's slow and painful demise. The worst part wasn't even the public nature of the announcement, though that stung like alcohol on an open wound. The worst part was watching Kimberly Hayes, this woman I had trusted with my most vulnerable thoughts and fears, smile with the satisfied contentment of someone who had won a prize she'd been coveting for months. She had sat in that therapy office, taking notes while I confessed my insecurities about not being emotionally available enough, about my long work hours affecting our intimacy, about my fears that Marcus was growing distant. I had bared my soul to her, seeking guidance on how to save my marriage, never suspecting that she was already planning to inherit it. "How long?" The question escaped my lips before I could stop it, my voice cutting through the awkward murmur of conversations that had started up around us. Every head in the room swiveled back toward our little triangle of destruction, guests probably grateful for the drama that would give them something to talk about for years. Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable for the first time all evening. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw working silently as he calculated how much truth he could afford to reveal. Rachel, this isn't the place for that conversation. You made it the place when you decided to announce our divorce at our anniversary party, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when inside I felt like I was falling through space. So I'll ask again, how long have you two been together? Kimberly stepped forward, her professional demeanor sliding into place like armor. Rachel, I understand you're upset, but Marcus and I didn't act on our feelings until after we recognized that your marriage was beyond saving. The therapeutic relationship always remained appropriate and professional, the careful phrasing, the therapeutic doublespeak, the way she managed to sound both sympathetic and condescending at the same time made my teeth ache. This was the woman who had charged us $200 an hour to save our marriage while systematically destroying it from the inside. I wondered how many other couples she had counseled into divorce so she could pick through the emotional wreckage for whatever appealed to her. Beyond saving, I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. Funny, because I thought we were making progress. I thought that's why Marcus suggested we celebrate with this party. I thought that's why he helped me plan it, why he picked out my dress, why he insisted we invite everyone we care about. A flush of red crept up Marcus's neck, the way it always did when he got caught in a contradiction. I had seen that same reaction when I'd found discrepancies in his business expenses, when he'd claimed to be at the gym but came home smelling like cigarettes, when he'd insisted he was too tired for date nights but somehow had energy to help Kimberly move apartments last month. All those little warning signs I had ignored or rationalized away, desperate to believe that our marriage was worth saving. The party was already planned, he said weakly. I thought it would be easier to make the announcement when everyone was together. He thought it would be easier to destroy my life in front of an audience than to have an honest conversation in private. Easier to humiliate me publicly than to show me the basic respect of ending our marriage with dignity. Easier to turn what should have been a celebration of our love into a theatrical performance of his betrayal. I looked around the room at the faces of people who had known us as a couple, who had attended our wedding, who had supported us through job changes and family deaths and all the ordinary struggles of building a life together. Some looked genuinely shocked and sympathetic. Others wore expressions that suggested they had suspected something was wrong long before I had. A few seemed almost entertained by the drama unfolding in front of them, probably already crafting the stories they would tell at brunches and book clubs for months to come. The jazz quartet had stopped playing, their instruments silent as they tried to decide whether to pack up or wait for some signal that the evening might continue. The catering staff hovered uncertainly near the kitchen doors, probably wondering if they should start clearing the barely touched hors d'oeuvre or if there was still hope this night could be salvaged into something resembling a normal celebration. But there was no salvaging. There was no pretending that everything was fine, no graceful way to transition from happy anniversary to we're getting divorced and I'm leaving you for our therapist. Marcus had made sure of that with his timing and his method. He had turned our anniversary into his liberation day, our celebration into his coming out party, with the woman who had helped him realize he didn't want to be married to me anymore. I thought about all the conversations we'd had in Kimberly's office, all the exercises she'd assigned us to rebuild intimacy and trust, the weekly date nights where we were supposed to focus on each other without distraction, the communication techniques she'd taught us for expressing our needs and fears, the homework assignments about gratitude and appreciation that I had taken so seriously, writing pages about what I loved about Marcus while he apparently wrote grocery lists or planned his exit strategy. Had he been honest about anything during those sessions? Had he ever actually tried to save our marriage? Or had therapy just been an elaborate performance designed to make his eventual departure look justified and inevitable? Had Kimberly been a neutral professional trying to help us? Or had she been an accomplice from the beginning, helping Marcus craft a narrative that would make me the failing partner while positioning herself as his salvation? The questions multiplied in my mind like a virus, each one spawning 3 more until I felt dizzy with the scope of the deception. 6 months of therapy, 6 months of believing we were working toward the same goal, 6 months of examining my own shortcomings and trying to be a better wife while my husband and his counselor plotted my replacement behind closed doors. Nicole finally broke free from her paralysis near the dessert table and crossed the room toward me, her heels clicking against the marble with the decisive rhythm of someone who had reached her limit. Rachel, we're leaving, right now, but I couldn't move. I stood there in my emerald dress, surrounded by the wreckage of my anniversary party, staring at my husband and the woman who had helped him destroy our marriage with clinical precision. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to make a scene that would at least match the magnitude of what had just been done to me. Another part wanted to collapse, to let the weight of this betrayal crush me into the marble floor along with the broken champagne glass. Instead, I heard myself asking the question that would haunt me for weeks afterward. Was any of it real, Marcus? The therapy, the progress we thought we were making, the reasons you wanted to celebrate tonight. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been regret or nostalgia or simple discomfort at being forced to confront the human cost of his carefully orchestrated escape plan. I thought it was real at the time, he said finally. But Kimberly helped me understand that sometimes we convince ourselves we're happy when we're actually just comfortable. More therapeutic language, more clinical distance, more ways of making our 8-year marriage sound like a mistake he had finally found the courage to correct. I wondered if he had practiced this speech in Kimberly's office, if they had role-played this moment during their private sessions, if she had coached him on how to deliver maximum damage with minimum accountability. Comfortable, I repeated, and felt something cold settle in my chest. 8 years of marriage, and the best you can say is that I made you comfortable. That's not what I meant. No, Marcus. That's exactly what you meant. I bent down and picked up one of the larger pieces of broken champagne glass, watching the light catch the sharp edges. Comfortable. Like an old sweater you keep meaning to donate but never quite get around to throwing away. The room had gone completely silent again, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. I could feel their attention like heat against my skin, their collective breath held in anticipation of whether I would break down or fight back or simply walk away with whatever dignity I could manage to salvage from this disaster. But as I stood there holding that piece of broken crystal, something unexpected happened. Instead of the devastation I expected to feel, instead of the crushing weight of loss and betrayal that should have driven me to my knees, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. Cold, sharp, surgical clarity that cut through 8 years of self-doubt and people-pleasing and desperate attempts to be the wife Marcus wanted me to be. I had been trying so hard to save our marriage that I had never stopped to ask whether it was worth saving. I had been so focused on becoming the woman he needed that I had forgotten who I actually was underneath all that accommodation and compromise. I had spent 6 months in therapy examining my own flaws and failures, without ever questioning whether the problem might not be entirely mine to solve. And now, standing in the ruins of my anniversary party with my husband's arm around another woman, I realized that Marcus had actually done me a favor. He had shown me exactly who he was, a man who could smile and plan a party and pick out a dress for his wife while simultaneously planning to leave her, a man who could sit through months of therapy and pretend to work on their relationship while falling in love with their counselor, a man who valued his own comfort over his wife's dignity, his own happiness over his marriage vows, his own convenience over the basic human decency of an honest conversation. This wasn't a man worth fighting for. This wasn't a marriage worth saving. This wasn't a life worth the exhausting effort of trying to be someone I wasn't in order to keep someone who didn't want to stay. I set the piece of broken glass on the nearest table and smoothed my emerald dress, the one Marcus had chosen for me to wear to my own execution. "Thank you," I said, and watched confusion flicker across both their faces. "Thank you for showing me who you really are, before I wasted any more years trying to be someone worthy of loving you. Thank you for making this choice so I didn't have to, and thank you for choosing each other, because you both deserve exactly what you're getting." I walked toward the exit with my head held high, Nicole falling into step beside me like a bodyguard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind us, I could hear the party slowly disintegrating, conversations resuming in shocked whispers. The jazz quartet finally beginning to pack up their instruments. the catering staff starting to clear tables that would never see the celebration they were prepared for. But I didn't look back. For the first time in 8 years, I walked towards something instead of away from it, even though I had no idea what that something would turn out to be. I just knew that whatever came next had to be better than what I was leaving behind. The valet brought my car around, and Nicole slid into the passenger seat without asking where we were going. "Your place or mine?" she asked as I started the engine. "Yours," I said without hesitation. I need to figure out what happens next, and I can't do that in the house where I've been pretending to be happy for the past 6 months. As we drove through the Portland streets toward Nicole's apartment in the Pearl District, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was still wearing the emerald dress, still had her makeup perfectly applied, still looked like someone who had been planning to celebrate her anniversary just 2 hours earlier. But her eyes held something new, something that hadn't been there when the evening started. Not anger, though that would come later. Not sadness, though there would be plenty of time for that too. What I saw in my own reflection was possibility. For the first time in years, my future was completely unwritten, completely mine to determine. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and absolutely nothing like the comfortable cage I had been living in for so long. I had no idea that this was just the beginning, that the real story wouldn't start until I discovered exactly what Kimberly Hayes had been hiding about her professional life and her funding sources. I had no idea that my background in financial consulting and my connections in the nonprofit world would prove to be weapons I never knew I possessed. I had no idea that Marcus's betrayal would turn out to be the catalyst for the most empowering period of my entire life. All I knew was that I was finally free to become whoever I was supposed to be, and that Marcus Thompson and Kimberly Hayes had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by underestimating exactly who they were dealing with. The real revenge, I would soon discover, wouldn't be emotional or dramatic or designed to hurt them the way they had hurt me. It would be precise, professional, and absolutely devastating in ways they never saw coming. But that night, driving through the city with my sister beside me and my old life crumbling in the rearview mirror, I was content to simply breathe freely for the first time in months and plan my next move from a position of strength, rather than desperation. Tomorrow I would start building something new. Tonight I would mourn what I thought I had lost and celebrate what I had actually gained. The difference between those two things would prove to be everything. The morning after my marriage imploded in front of 50 witnesses, I woke up on Nicole's couch with mascara stains on her throw pillows and the taste of cheap wine coating my tongue like regret. Sunlight streamed through her floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in the harsh clarity that only comes after you've been forced to see your life for what it really is, rather than what you've been pretending it could become. Nicole padded into the living room carrying 2 cups of coffee, her hair still messy from sleep, but her eyes sharp with the kind of protective anger that had gotten her suspended from high school for punching a girl who spread rumors about me. "I called your office and told them you had a family emergency," she said, settling into the armchair across from me. "Also, Marcus has been texting you all night. I turned your phone off because I was afraid I might answer it and tell him exactly what I think of his announcement strategy." I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body aching like I had been in a physical fight rather than an emotional ambush. The emerald dress lay crumpled on the floor where I had stepped out of it the night before, leaving it like shed skin from a version of myself I never wanted to inhabit again. What did he say? The usual garbage. That he never meant to hurt you. That the timing was bad but he couldn't keep living a lie. That he hopes you can eventually understand and be happy for him. Nicole's voice dripped with disdain as she scrolled through the messages. "Oh, and apparently he wants to discuss the house and finances when you're ready to have a rational conversation about your future." The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Less than 12 hours after announcing our divorce at our anniversary party, Marcus was already trying to manage the narrative and control the aftermath. He wanted to discuss our future rationally, as if there had been anything rational about his behavior. He wanted me to eventually understand and be happy for him. As if 8 years of marriage could be dismissed with therapeutic platitudes and good intentions. But it was the mention of finances that made something cold and calculating settle in my chest. Marcus knew that I handled our household budget and personal investments, but he had no idea about the scope of my professional connections or the extent of my involvement in Portland's nonprofit funding network. During our marriage, I had kept my work life and personal life carefully compartmentalized, partly out of habit and partly because Marcus had never shown much interest in the details of my financial consulting practice. He knew I worked with nonprofit organizations, helping them structure their funding and manage their endowments, but he thought it was boring administrative work that paid well but held no real influence. He had no idea that over the past 5 years I had become one of the most trusted advisors to some of Oregon's largest charitable foundations, or that my recommendations could make or break funding applications worth millions of dollars. More importantly, he had no idea that 6 months ago I had been approached by the Oregon Community Foundation to join their board of directors, specifically to oversee their new initiative focused on child welfare and foster care service. The position came with access to confidential information about funding recipients, grant applications, and the financial audits that determined which organizations continued to receive support and which ones found their money redirected to more deserving causes. Marcus thought he knew who he was divorcing. He thought he was leaving behind a comfortable housewife who happened to work in finance, someone who would be hurt and devastated but ultimately manageable in the dissolution of our shared assets. He had no idea that he had just declared war on someone who could destroy both his personal happiness and his girlfriend's professional career with a few well-placed phone calls and carefully documented evidence. The irony was that I had actually been looking forward to telling him about the board position. It represented the culmination of years of building my reputation in the nonprofit sector, and I had planned to share the news during our anniversary celebration as a symbol of how much we both had to be proud of in our individual achievement. Instead, that announcement would now serve a very different purpose. I spent the next 3 days at Nicole's apartment, officially taking bereavement leave from my office, while I planned my next moves with the methodical precision I usually reserved for restructuring failing investment portfolio. The first step was gathering intelligence, and Marcus's social media habits made that easier than it should have been. His Facebook and Instagram accounts, which he had never bothered to make private, provided a timeline of his relationship with Kimberly that stretched back much further than either of them had admitted. There were photos from charity events where they appeared in the background together months before we had started therapy, restaurant check-ins at places Marcus had claimed to be visiting with business contact, running events where they had both participated, wearing matching team shirts for causes I had never heard him express interest in, even vacation photos from a weekend trip to the coast that Marcus had told me was a solo retreat to clear his head about our marriage problem. The pattern painted a picture of a relationship that had been developing for at least a year, possibly longer, while I was being gaslit into believing that our marriage problems were primarily my fault for being emotionally unavailable and working too much. Every therapy session where Kimberly had gently suggested that I might need to examine my priorities and make more time for emotional intimacy had been delivered by a woman who was already intimately involved with my husband. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching Kimberly's professional background more thoroughly. Her LinkedIn profile listed her current position as Director of Family Services at a private counseling center called Cascade Therapeutic Solutions. But a deeper dive into Oregon's professional licensing database revealed something interesting. Kimberly had only been licensed as a clinical social worker for 3 years, and her previous employment history included a 2-year gap that she had explained away as time spent completing additional certification. What she hadn't mentioned was that during those 2 years, she had been under investigation by the Oregon Board of Licensed Clinical Social Workers for boundary violations with clients. The case had been quietly settled with a censure and mandatory supervision, but the details were still accessible if you knew where to look and had the right professional connections to request confidential records. More disturbing was the financial structure of Cascade Therapeutic Solutions itself. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard private practice specializing in marriage and family therapy. But according to their tax filings, which I could access through my work with the Oregon Community Foundation, nearly 60% of their operating budget came from grants specifically designated for foster care and child welfare service. This meant that Kimberly Hayes, who was presenting herself as a marriage counselor in private practice, was actually primarily funded by public money intended to support vulnerable children in the foster care system. The grants required detailed reporting on how the funds were being used, including documentation of services provided, populations served, and outcomes achieved. I spent 2 sleepless nights cross-referencing Kimberly's client intake record, which were supposed to be confidential but had been included in a batch of compliance documents I reviewed as part of my board duties, with the services Cascade Therapeutic Solutions claimed to be providing in their grant reports. The discrepancies were staggering according to their funding applications. They were providing intensive family reunification services to foster families, crisis intervention for at-risk youth, and therapeutic support for children aging out of the foster care system. According to their actual client records, they were primarily seeing middle-class couples for marriage counseling and wealthy individuals seeking therapy for anxiety and depression. In other words, Kimberly Hayes was systematically defrauding the foster care system, taking money intended to help the most vulnerable children in Oregon, and using it to fund a lucrative private practice that served clients who could afford to pay market rates for therapy. The estimated amount of misappropriated funds, based on 3 years of grant awards and documented services, was approaching $2 million. But the most damning evidence was hidden in the personnel files that Cascade Therapeutic Solutions had submitted as part of their grant application. These files were supposed to demonstrate that their staff members had the appropriate qualifications and experience to work with foster care populations. Kimberly's file included fabricated credentials, inflated experience claims, and references from supervisors who, when I discreetly contacted them, had never actually worked with her in a foster care capacity. She had built her entire professional reputation on lies, stolen money intended for vulnerable children, and used her fraudulent credentials to gain access to private information about couples seeking help for their marriage. The woman who had counseled Marcus and me about honesty and communication had been living a lie so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of her professional and personal life. The question now was not whether I had enough evidence to destroy her career and potentially send her to prison. The question was how to use that evidence in a way that would deliver maximum impact, while ensuring that the misappropriated funds were recovered and redirected to their intended purpose. Marcus had made his choice to leave me for a woman he believed was a respectable professional who could offer him the emotional connection he claimed our marriage lacked. He had no idea that his new girlfriend was a con artist who had been stealing from foster children while manipulating vulnerable couples during their most desperate moments. I could have simply reported Kimberly to the appropriate authorities and let the justice system handle the consequence, but that would have been merciful in a way that their treatment of me had not been. They had chosen to humiliate me publicly, to make my pain part of their love story, to turn my anniversary into their coming out party. They deserved to have their own secrets exposed with the same theatrical flair they had used to destroy my marriage. The plan that began forming in my mind was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequence. Marcus valued his reputation in the business community above almost everything else. His construction company depended on relationships with city officials, nonprofit organizations, and community leaders who would not look kindly on someone associated with foster care fraud. His new relationship with Kimberly, which he was so proud to have announced publicly, would become a liability that could destroy everything he had spent years building. But timing would be everything. I needed to gather additional evidence, build relationships with the right people, and position myself as the credible whistleblower who had discovered this fraud through legitimate channels rather than personal vindictiveness. I needed to make sure that when the story broke, it would be impossible to dismiss as the desperate revenge of a bitter ex-wife. The Oregon Community Foundation's next board meeting was scheduled for the following month, and I would be presenting my recommendations for the upcoming round of child welfare grants. Several major local media outlets would be covering the event, as it represented the largest single distribution of foster care funding in the state's history. It would be the perfect venue to raise concerns about oversight and accountability in the grant process. I spent the following weeks building my case with the meticulous attention to detail that had made me successful in financial consulting. Every document was photocopied and verified. Every claim was cross-referenced with multiple sources. Every connection was mapped and documented until I had created an investigative file that would make seasoned prosecutors envious. At the same time, I began quietly reaching out to other couples who had been counseled by Kimberly at Cascade Therapeutic Solutions. The conversations were delicate, requiring me to express concern about therapeutic practices without revealing the full scope of what I had discovered, but the patterns that emerged were disturbing and consistent. Multiple couples reported that their therapy sessions seemed to focus more on identifying fundamental incompatibilities than on developing strategies for improving their relationship. Several mentioned that Kimberly had suggested that some marriages were beyond saving, and that the healthiest choice might be to end things amicably rather than continue struggling. At least 4 couples had divorced during or shortly after completing therapy with her. Most disturbing was the revelation that Kimberly had maintained contact with several of the divorced men, offering ongoing support during their transition to single life. 2 of them admitted to brief romantic relationships with her in the months following their divorces, relationships that had ended when the men began questioning whether their marriages might have been salvageable with different therapeutic guidance. The patterns suggested that Kimberly Hayes was not just a fraudulent therapist stealing from foster children. She was a predator who systematically identified vulnerable marriages, undermined the relationships through manipulative counseling, and then positioned herself as a romantic option for the men once their marriages had been destroyed. Marcus was not her first victim, and if she continued practicing, he would not be her last, but he would be the most publicly visible thanks to his decision to announce their relationship at our anniversary party. His association with her would become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel her entire criminal enterprise. The delicious irony was that Marcus thought he had chosen the nuclear option by humiliating me publicly. He thought he had burned all bridges and made reconciliation impossible, forcing me to accept his decision and move on with whatever dignity I could salvage. He had no idea that his dramatic announcement had actually provided me with the perfect cover for what would become the most satisfying professional achievement of my career. When the Oregon Community Foundation meeting finally arrived, I dressed in my most conservative business suit and carried a leather briefcase containing 3 years of documented evidence that would change dozens of lives and redirect millions of dollars back to the children who needed it most. Marcus would be in the audience, I knew, because his construction company was hoping to bid on the new youth housing projects that would be funded by the grants I was about to recommend. He would watch me deliver what he assumed was a routine presentation about funding allocation and risk assessment, never suspecting that I was actually detonating a bomb that would destroy his girlfriend's career, expose her criminal activity, and make his public association with her a liability he would spend years trying to overcome. The best part was that everything I was about to do was not only ethical and legal, but actually represented the most important work of my professional life. I was not seeking revenge by lying or manipulating or stooping to their level of deception. I was simply doing my job with exceptional thoroughness and perfect timing. Kimberly Hayes had stolen from vulnerable children and destroyed vulnerable marriages. Marcus had chosen to associate himself with her publicly and dramatically. Now they would both live with the consequences of those choices, just as I had been forced to live with the consequences of trusting them both. The only difference was that their consequences would be delivered with the same public spectacle they had used to announce their relationship. Sometimes justice is not just about the outcome but about the method of delivery, and I intended to give them exactly the kind of theatrical revelation they had given me. As I walked into the Oregon Community Foundation's conference room that morning, I smiled for the first time since my anniversary party. Today would be the day that Marcus Thompson and Kimberly Hayes learned what it felt like to have their lives destroyed by someone they had underestimated, and I was going to enjoy every moment of watching their carefully constructed world collapse under the weight of the truth they had tried so hard to hide. The Oregon Community Foundation's conference room buzzed with quiet conversations as Portland's most influential philanthropists, city officials, and nonprofit leaders filed in for what they believed would be a routine quarterly meeting about grant distribution. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table, where I sat reviewing my presentation materials one final time, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to unleash. I had spent 3 weeks crafting this moment with surgical precision. Every slide in my presentation had been vetted by the Foundation's legal team. Every piece of evidence had been verified through multiple sources, and every recommendation I would make was backed by irrefutable documentation. To anyone watching, I would appear to be delivering a standard report on grant oversight and funding accountability. Only I knew that I was actually orchestrating the systematic destruction of Kimberly Hayes's criminal enterprise and Marcus's carefully cultivated professional reputation. The irony of the setting was not lost on me. This very conference room had hosted our wedding reception 8 years ago, when the foundation's previous director had offered the space as a gift to celebrate Marcus and my union. We had danced to that same jazz quartet in this room, surrounded by many of the same people who were now settling into their seats to hear me deliver what would effectively be Marcus's social and professional obituary. He entered the room at exactly 9:15, wearing the charcoal suit I had bought him for his birthday last year, his confidence evident in the way he worked the crowd before taking a seat in the section reserved for potential contractors. Marcus had no idea why I was presenting today, assuming I was simply fulfilling routine board obligations that had nothing to do with him or his new life with Kimberly. His relaxed demeanor and casual conversations with other attendees suggested he viewed this as a networking opportunity rather than the public execution it was about to become. Derek Walsh sat beside him, both men scrolling through their phones and occasionally pointing out attractive women in the audience with the casual misogyny that had always made me uncomfortable but which I had learned to ignore during our marriage. Watching them now, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing strangers rather than people who had once been central to my daily life. Foundation Director Margaret Chen called the meeting to order, her crisp voice cutting through the morning chatter as she reviewed the agenda. The first hour would cover routine business, financial reports, and updates on existing grant programs. My presentation on oversight and accountability would begin at 10:30, followed by voting on the new round of funding allocations that represented $43 million in grants to child welfare organizations across Oregon. I had positioned my presentation strategically in the agenda, knowing that by 10:30 the local media representatives would have arrived to cover the grant announcements, and the full board would be present for the voting session. Maximum audience, maximum impact, maximum witnesses to what was about to unfold. During the preliminary presentations, I caught Marcus checking his watch several times, probably calculating how long he needed to stay before he could slip out for his lunch meeting with the Urban Development Committee. He had always been impatient with meetings that didn't directly benefit him, and I could see him fighting the urge to leave early. His restlessness would prove to be unfortunate, because the moment he tried to exit would coincide perfectly with the most damaging revelations of my presentation. At 10:25, Margaret Chen introduced me with the kind of glowing professional biography that made Marcus sit up straighter in his chair. I had never talked much about my work accomplishments at home, preferring to keep conversations focused on his projects and achievements. Hearing the full scope of my credentials and influence in the nonprofit sector laid out publicly seemed to surprise him, judging by the way he exchanged glances with Derek and pulled out his phone to text someone, probably Kimberly. I walked to the podium carrying the leather portfolio that contained 3 years of documented evidence against the woman Marcus had left me for, feeling the weight of justice balanced perfectly in my hand. The presentation slides were already loaded, beginning with innocuous charts about grant distribution patterns and recipient demographics that would lull the audience into expecting routine, administrative updates. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present our findings on grant oversight and recipient accountability, I began, my voice carrying easily through the room's excellent acoustics. Over the past 6 months, our audit committee has been conducting enhanced due diligence on funding recipients, with particular focus on organizations serving vulnerable populations where oversight challenges have historically allowed misuse of resources. The opening was deliberately dry, designed to sound like standard bureaucratic language that would bore most of the audience into checking their phones rather than paying close attention. I needed Marcus to be distracted when the real substance began, caught off guard rather than prepared to minimize damage or make strategic exits. Today I'll be sharing our findings regarding systematic fraud within the foster care services sector, including documentation of approximately $2.3 million in misappropriated funds, fabricated credentials among service providers, and what appears to be deliberate manipulation of vulnerable families seeking therapeutic intervention. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, conversations stopping mid-sentence as the implications of those numbers registered with people who understood how much good could be done with $2 million in properly allocated resources. Margaret Chen leaned forward in her chair, her expression sharpening with the focused attention of someone who had built her career on exposing institutional failures and holding nonprofits accountable for their stewardship of public funds. Marcus was still looking at his phone, apparently texting with enough concentration that he missed the sudden tension that had gripped everyone else in the room. I could see Derek elbowing him gently, trying to draw his attention to what was happening at the podium, but Marcus waved him off with the dismissive gesture of someone who assumed his wife was delivering boring financial reports that had nothing to do with him. Our investigation began when routine cross-referencing of service delivery reports revealed significant discrepancies between claimed services and documented client interactions at several funded organizations. Advancing to a slide that showed a map of Oregon with red dots marking the locations of affected programs. The most egregious example involves an organization called Cascade Therapeutic Solutions, which has received $1.8 million over 3 years specifically to provide services to foster families, at-risk youth, and children aging out of state care. The mention of Cascade Therapeutic Solutions finally got Marcus's attention. I watched him look up from his phone with the slow dawning expression of someone beginning to realize that the boring meeting he had been ignoring was actually about to become the most important event of his life. His face went through several rapid changes as he processed the name of Kimberly's workplace being mentioned in the context of fraud and misappropriated funds. According to their grant applications and quarterly report, Cascade Therapeutic Solutions claimed to serve over 400 foster families during this period, providing intensive reunification therapy, crisis intervention, and transitional support services. I said, clicking to a slide that showed their claimed service numbers in neat chart and graph. However, our audit of actual client records reveals that fewer than 30 families in the foster care system received any services from this organization during the same period. Murmurs rippled through the audience as people began calculating the obvious implication. If Cascade had been funded to serve 400 families but only actually served 30, where had the money gone? What services had they actually been providing with resources intended for vulnerable children? Marcus was now sitting rigidly in his chair, his phone forgotten in his lap as he stared at me with the expression of someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. He was beginning to understand that this presentation was not coincidentally about his girlfriend's workplace, but was instead a methodical exposure of criminal activity that would inevitably implicate him by association. The discrepancy becomes even more concerning when we examine the credentials and qualifications of staff members at organizations like Cascade Therapeutic Solutions. I continued, advancing to a slide that showed organizational charts with highlighted positions. In multiple cases, we found fabricated educational backgrounds, misrepresented professional experience, and licensing violations that should have disqualified individuals from receiving funding to work with vulnerable populations. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of those accusations settle over the room while I made deliberate eye contact with Marcus. He was pale now, gripping the arms of his chair like he was trying to keep himself from bolting toward the exit. The realization that his new girlfriend might be the target of a criminal investigation was clearly sinking in, along with the understanding that his very public association with her was about to become a professional liability of catastrophic proportion. We discovered that Kimberly Hayes, who serves as Director of Family Services at Cascade Therapeutic Solutions and has been the primary recipient of foster care funding, holds credentials that cannot be verified through any accredited institution, and watched Marcus flinch as if I had physically struck him. Miss Hayes's claimed doctoral degree in clinical psychology appears to have been purchased from an unaccredited online program. Her licensing history includes a censure for boundary violations with client, and her previous employment claims include positions at organizations that have no record of her employment. The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing the exposure of a major fraud case that would likely result in criminal charges and headlines in every major newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. Several people were taking notes, and I could see at least 2 attendees discreetly recording the session on their phones. Margaret Chen's expression had shifted from professional interest to the kind of cold fury reserved for people who steal from children and vulnerable families. As someone who had dedicated her career to ensuring that charitable funds reached their intended recipients, the scope of the fraud I was describing represented a personal attack on everything she believed in. Our investigation also revealed patterns of behavior suggesting that Ms. Hayes used her position to deliberately undermine the marriages of clients seeking therapeutic services, with documented evidence of romantic relationships with at least 6 divorced men who had been her patients during marriage counseling. Clicking to a slide that showed a timeline of her relationships overlaid with the divorce dates of her former clients, this revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. I could see him processing the information that he was not Kimberly's first affair with a married client, that their relationship was not the unique and special connection he had believed it to be, but rather part of an established pattern of predatory behavior that she had perfected over years of practice. The timeline on the screen showed that Kimberly's relationships with former clients typically lasted between 4 and 8 months, ending when the men began asking questions about their therapy experience or when new clients became available. Marcus had been with her for 6 months, putting him well within the typical duration of her post-divorce affairs. The financial impact of this fraud extends beyond the direct theft of designated funds, I said, advancing to a slide that showed the broader economic consequence. Families who should have received legitimate therapeutic services were instead subjected to manipulative counseling designed to generate personal benefits for the provider. Children who should have been reunited with their families remained in foster care longer than necessary. Resources that should have supported vulnerable youth aging out of the system were instead used to fund a fraudulent private practice, serving affluent clients who could afford to pay market rates. The moral weight of those consequences was palpable in the room. These were not victimless financial crimes, but calculated theft from some of the most vulnerable people in society. Every dollar that Kimberly had stolen represented services that were not provided to children who needed them desperately. Marcus was now visibly sweating, his face cycling through shades of pale that suggested he was either going to be sick or pass out entirely. The magnitude of what I was revealing was clearly overwhelming him, not just because of the criminal implications for Kimberly, but because of what it meant about his own judgment and the very public way he had associated himself with her. Based on these findings, our committee is recommending immediate suspension of all funding to Cascade Therapeutic Solutions, referral of the case to both the Oregon Department of Justice and the FBI for criminal investigation, and implementation of enhanced oversight protocols to prevent similar fraud in future funding cycles, I announced, clicking to a slide that outlined the specific actions we were taking. The recommendations were met with immediate and unanimous approval from the board members, their voices overlapping as they expressed support for aggressive prosecution and recovery of the stolen funds. Several people specifically commended the thoroughness of the investigation and the courage required to expose fraud within the therapeutic community, but I was not finished. The final element of my presentation would be the piece that tied Marcus personally to the scandal in a way that would make his association with Kimberly impossible to dismiss or minimize. I should note that this investigation took on particular urgency when it came to my attention that Ms. Hayes had been providing marriage counseling to my husband and me during the same period when she was systematically defrauding the foster care system, I said, and felt the energy in the room shift from professional outrage to personal fascination. The therapeutic relationship that my husband believed was helping him realize his true feelings was actually being conducted by someone who was stealing from vulnerable children while manipulating our marriage for her own personal benefit. The gasp that went through the audience was audible, and I could see people turning to look at Marcus with expressions ranging from sympathy to disgust. He had become the human face of Kimberly's victims, the man who had been manipulated into destroying his marriage by a criminal who specialized in exactly that kind of psychological manipulation. My husband announced our divorce at our 8th anniversary party last month, citing irreconcilable differences and his new relationship with Miss Hayes. I continued, my voice steady despite the personal nature of what I was revealing. He had no idea that his therapist was a con artist who had been stealing from foster children, or that his marriage had been deliberately undermined by someone whose professional credentials were entirely fabricated. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone processing the implications of what they had just heard. Marcus was not just associated with a criminal, he was one of her victims, manipulated and deceived in the most intimate possible way. His decision to leave me for Kimberly had been based on therapeutic guidance from someone who was not qualified to provide therapy and who had systematically lied about her education, experience, and intention. The personal impact of this fraud cannot be separated from its broader consequences, I said, clicking to my final slide, which showed photographs of children who had been served by legitimate foster care programs, funded by the foundation. Every marriage that Hayes destroyed for her own entertainment was a family that could have provided stability for vulnerable children. Every dollar she stole was a resource that could have helped a child aging out of foster care or supported a family working toward reunification. I closed the presentation and returned to my seat, leaving the room in stunned silence, as people processed the full scope of what they had just witnessed. This had been more than a fraud investigation. It had been a masterclass in how personal betrayal and institutional corruption could intersect to cause maximum damage to both individual lives and vulnerable communities. Margaret Chen was the first to speak, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough institutional failures to know exactly how to respond. Rachel, on behalf of the entire foundation, I want to thank you for the courage and professionalism you've shown in bringing this matter to light. The board will be voting immediately to approve all recommended actions, and will be working closely with law enforcement to ensure that Hayes faces the full consequences of her actions. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, but I was watching Marcus rather than acknowledging the recognition. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at me with an expression that suggested he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The woman he had dismissed as comfortable and boring had just delivered a presentation that would likely result in his girlfriend's imprisonment and his own social exile from the professional community he valued above almost everything else. When the meeting finally adjourned, Marcus made no attempt to approach me or leave the room. He simply sat in his chair, probably calculating the personal and professional consequences of being publicly associated with someone who would soon be facing federal fraud charges. His phone was buzzing constantly, probably with messages from people who had watched the presentation and were trying to understand his connection to the scandal. I gathered my materials and walked past his section without acknowledgement, feeling the weight of justice finally balanced in my favor. The woman who had been humiliated at her anniversary party had just delivered a presentation that would be remembered as one of the most significant fraud exposures in Oregon nonprofit history. The comfortable housewife Marcus thought he was leaving behind had revealed herself to be someone with the power to destroy criminal enterprises and the professional credibility to be believed when she did it. As I left the conference room, I could hear urgent conversations breaking out behind me. People already making phone calls to colleagues and reporters who would want to cover this story. By the end of the day, Kimberly Hayes would be the subject of criminal investigations. Marcus Thompson would be known as the man who left his wife for a con artist, and I would be recognized as the whistleblower who had saved millions of dollars intended for vulnerable children. The revenge was perfect, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Everything I had revealed was documented fact. Every consequence they would face was the direct result of their own choices and actions. I had simply done my job with exceptional thoroughness and perfect timing, ensuring that the truth came out in the most public and damaging way possible. Marcus had wanted to humiliate me publicly, to make our divorce part of his grand romantic gesture with the woman who had helped him realize his true feelings. Instead, he had provided me with the perfect platform to expose them both as the frauds they really were, and to do it in front of an audience that included reporters, city officials, and everyone who mattered in Portland's professional community. The comfortable life he thought he was escaping had just revealed itself to be more interesting, more powerful, and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And the boring wife he thought he could discard with therapeutic justification had just proven that she was someone who should never have been underestimated. The first call came while I was still in the foundation building's parking garage, my phone buzzing with an unknown number as I sat in my car processing what had just transpired upstairs. The voice on the other end identified herself as Detective Sarah Martinez from the Oregon Department of Justice's White Collar Crime Division, and she wanted to schedule an interview to discuss my findings regarding Cascade Therapeutic Solutions as soon as possible. Within 3 hours, my phone had become a constant source of interruption. Reporters from the Oregonian, Willamette Week, and Portland Business Journal were all requesting statements about the fraud investigation. The FBI's Portland field office wanted to coordinate with my evidence file. The Oregon Board of Licensed Clinical Social Workers needed copies of my documentation to begin their disciplinary proceeding. Most surprisingly, I received a call from the Attorney General's office asking if I would be willing to serve as a consultant on what they were calling the largest foster care fraud case in the state's history. But it was the call from Marcus that I had been both dreading and anticipating since I walked out of that conference room. His name appeared on my screen at 4:30 in the afternoon, and I let it ring twice before answering with the calm professionalism I had perfected during 8 years of marriage to a man who required careful emotional management. Rach, his voice sounded hollow, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through our anniversary party announcement just 6 weeks earlier. "We need to talk, do we?" I asked, genuinely curious about what he thought there was left to discuss. "I thought you made your position quite clear at our anniversary celebration. You're moving in with Kimberly. We're getting divorced and you've found someone who can give you the emotional connection our marriage apparently lacked." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke again, his voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, not even during the worst fights of our marriage. "You knew, when you gave that presentation today, you knew everything about Kimberly, and you knew what it would do to me. I knew that Kimberly Hayes was systematically defrauding the foster care system and that my professional obligations required me to report those findings to the appropriate authorities," choosing my words with the precision of someone who understood that this conversation might eventually be scrutinized by a lawyer. "I also knew that you had chosen to associate yourself publicly with someone whose professional credentials were fabricated and whose therapeutic methods were designed to destroy marriages rather than heal them." "That's not what I mean, and you know." The desperation in his voice was becoming more apparent with each exchange. "You planned this, you timed it perfectly to cause maximum damage to both of us. You turned our personal problems into a public scandal." The accusation was so rich with irony that I actually laughed. A sound that seemed to surprise us both. "Marcus, you announced our divorce at our anniversary party in front of 50 people, including reporters and city officials. You made our personal problems public the moment you decided that humiliating me would be an acceptable price for your grand romantic gesture. I simply ensured that the public got the complete story rather than just your carefully edited version." Another long pause, during which I could hear background noise that sounded like traffic and urgent conversations. Marcus was probably calling from his truck, parked somewhere he thought was safe while his world collapsed around him in real time. I wondered if Kimberly was with him, or if she was already consulting criminal defense attorneys about the charges she would soon be facing. "The FBI called me," he said finally. "They want to interview me about my relationship with Kimberly and whether I had any knowledge of her business practices. They said I might be considered a co-conspirator if I benefited financially from her illegal activity." This was the conversation I had been waiting for, the moment when Marcus would finally understand the full scope of what his romantic choices had cost him. Federal investigators would be examining every aspect of his relationship with Kimberly, looking for evidence that he had knowingly participated in or benefited from her fraud scheme. His construction company's contracts with city agencies would be scrutinized for any appearance of impropriety. His reputation in the business community would be permanently damaged by his association with someone facing federal charges. "Did you benefit financially from her illegal activities?" I asked, genuinely curious about how deep his involvement might have gone. "Did she use stolen foster care funds to pay for your romantic getaways, or help finance your business ventures?" "Of course not." The indignation in his voice suggested he was telling the truth, at least about direct financial benefits. "I had no idea where her money came from. She told me she had a successful private practice and some family investments. I never questioned the details because it wasn't my business." But even as he protested his innocence, I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Marcus was a successful businessman who understood financial structures and profit margins better than most people. If he had bothered to look closely at Kimberly's lifestyle and claimed income sources, he might have noticed discrepancies that would have raised questions about where her money was really coming from. The problem, Marcus, is that willful ignorance isn't a defense when you're dating someone under federal investigation for fraud, I said. The FBI will want to know why a successful businessman didn't notice that his girlfriend's lifestyle didn't match her claimed income sources. They'll want to know whether you helped her hide assets or provided business advice that enabled her criminal activities. The traffic noise in the background had stopped, suggesting that Marcus had pulled over or reached his destination. When he spoke again, his voice carried the flat tone of someone beginning to understand the true magnitude of his situation. "This is going to destroy everything I've worked for, isn't it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Marcus's construction company depended on relationships with city agencies and nonprofit organizations, many of which would distance themselves from anyone associated with foster care fraud. His social standing in Portland's business community would evaporate the moment local media began covering the story. His new relationship with Kimberly, which he had been so proud to announce publicly, would become a liability that followed him for years. "That depends on how you handle the next few weeks," I said, surprised to find myself offering what amounted to strategic advice to the man who had humiliated me 6 weeks earlier. "If you cooperate fully with investigators and distance yourself immediately from Kimberly, you might be able to minimize the damage. If you try to protect her or hide your involvement, you'll likely face charges as an accessory after the fact." "You're giving me advice?" The disbelief in his voice was understandable. "After what I did to you, after the way I treated you, you're actually trying to help me?" The question forced me to examine my own motivations more closely than I had been willing to do until that moment. Was I offering Marcus guidance out of some lingering affection, or was I simply ensuring that his cooperation with investigators would maximize the consequences for Kimberly? The answer was probably more complicated than either of us wanted to acknowledge. "I'm giving you information that any competent attorney would provide," I said finally. "What you do with that information is entirely up to you, but you should understand that your decision to leave me for Kimberly Hayes will be the most expensive mistake of your life, regardless of how the criminal investigation resolves." The call ended without a formal goodbye, leaving me alone in my car with the satisfaction of knowing that Marcus was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his choices. He had traded 8 years of marriage for a 6-month affair with a con artist who would soon be facing federal prison time. He had destroyed his relationship with someone who had the professional connections and financial expertise to protect him, in favor of someone whose criminal activities would likely destroy his business and social standing. Over the following days, the story exploded across Portland media with the intensity I had anticipated, but the scope that even I found surprising. The Oregonian ran a front-page exposé about foster care fraud that included photographs of both Kimberly and Marcus, with a caption identifying him as the husband who left his wife for the accused fraudster. Portland Business Journal published a detailed analysis of how Cascade Therapeutic Solutions had manipulated grant requirements and falsified service records, using Marcus's construction company as an example of how legitimate businesses could be damaged by association with criminal enterprises. Most devastating was the investigative piece that Willamette Week published about Kimberly's pattern of targeting married men in therapy. The article included interviews with 3 of her former clients who admitted to romantic relationships with her following their divorces, creating a timeline that showed Marcus was simply the most recent victim in a years-long pattern of predatory behavior. The interviews revealed details that made Marcus's situation even more pathetic than I had initially realized. Each of the men described almost identical experiences, therapy sessions that focused on identifying fundamental incompatibilities in their marriage, suggestions that some relationships were beyond saving, and ongoing emotional support during their divorces that gradually evolved into romantic relationships. The pattern was so consistent that it suggested Kimberly had developed a systematic approach to identifying vulnerable marriages and harvesting the men for her own purposes. One particularly damaging quote came from David Chen, a software engineer who had been divorced 3 years earlier after therapy with Kimberly. Looking back, I realize she was never trying to save our marriage, he told the reporter. Every session was designed to convince me that my wife and I were incompatible. When I finally filed for divorce, Kimberly was right there offering comfort and understanding. It took me months to realize that she had engineered the whole situation. The article included a sidebar analyzing the financial cost of Kimberly's marriage destruction, calculating that her 6 confirmed affairs with former clients had resulted in divorce settlements totaling over $3 million in transferred assets. The money had been redistributed from women who had trusted her professional guidance to men who had been manipulated into leaving their wives, creating a hidden economic impact that extended far beyond the foster care fraud. Reading these accounts, I felt a mixture of vindication and genuine sympathy for Marcus that surprised me with its intensity. He had not been the calculating adulterer I had assumed him to be, but rather another victim of someone who had perfected the art of psychological manipulation for financial and personal gain. This realization didn't excuse his decision to humiliate me publicly, but it did provide context that made his behavior more understandable if not forgivable. The FBI investigation moved with surprising speed, probably motivated by the public attention the case was receiving and the clear documentation I had provided. Within 10 days of my presentation, federal agents executed search warrants at both Cascade Therapeutic Solutions and Kimberly's personal residence, seizing computers, financial records, and client files that would provide additional evidence of her fraudulent activity. Kimberly was arrested on a Tuesday morning while arriving at her office, the perp walk captured by news cameras that had been tipped off about the timing. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, wearing the same conservative business attire she had worn to our therapy sessions, became the defining photograph of Portland's largest foster care fraud scandal. Marcus was not arrested, but he was interviewed twice by federal investigators and once by state police detectives working the case. According to Derek Walsh, who called me with updates that he thought I deserved to hear, Marcus had hired one of Portland's most expensive criminal defense attorneys despite having no formal charges filed against him. The legal fees alone would probably cost him more than our entire divorce settlement. The business consequences for Marcus unfolded exactly as I had predicted. 3 city contracts worth over $2 million were suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The Urban Development Committee that had been considering his company for a major housing project voted to exclude him from the bidding process. 2 nonprofit organizations canceled construction projects rather than risk association with someone connected to the foster care fraud scandal. Most personally devastating was his expulsion from the Portland Business Association, the professional organization that had been central to his social and networking activities for over a decade. The vote was unanimous and immediate, with several members publicly stating that association with foster care fraud was incompatible with the organization's commitment to community service and ethical business practices. But it was the collapse of his relationship with Kimberly that provided the most satisfying element of poetic justice. According to court documents that became public during her bail hearing, Kimberly had been draining her personal bank accounts in preparation for fleeing the country when she was arrested. The romantic partner Marcus had chosen over his marriage had been planning to abandon him the moment her criminal activities were exposed, leaving him to face the consequences of their public association alone. The bail hearing also revealed that Kimberly had been conducting simultaneous romantic relationships with 2 other men while dating Marcus, both of whom were former therapy clients who believed they were in exclusive relationships with her. The revelation that he had been just one of several men being manipulated simultaneously added another layer of humiliation to his already compromised situation. I watched these developments unfold from the safety of my new apartment in the Pearl District, where I had moved permanently after deciding that returning to the house Marcus and I had shared would feel like stepping backward into a life that no longer fit. The space was smaller but entirely mine, decorated with furniture I had chosen rather than compromised on, filled with books and art that reflected my actual interest rather than our combined aesthetic. The professional recognition that followed my fraud investigation exceeded anything I had experienced during my previous career. The Oregon Community Foundation offered me a permanent position as Director of Oversight and Accountability, with a salary that was nearly double what I had been earning in private consulting. The Attorney General's office retained me as an expert consultant on nonprofit fraud cases, providing additional income and the satisfaction of knowing that my work was preventing other organizations from victimizing vulnerable populations. Most unexpectedly, I received invitations to speak at conferences across the country about fraud detection and institutional accountability. The presentation that had been designed to destroy Marcus and Kimberly had established me as a national expert on nonprofit oversight, opening professional opportunities that would never have been available if I had remained married to someone who saw my work as boring administrative details. 3 months after my presentation, I received a formal letter from the FBI, thanking me for my cooperation in what they described as one of the most significant foster care fraud cases in federal history. Kimberly Hayes had pled guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, accepting a plea agreement that would result in 7 years in federal prison and full restitution of the stolen funds. The letter also mentioned that my evidence had been instrumental in identifying similar fraud schemes in 3 other states, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of over $8 million in misappropriated funds that could now be redirected to legitimate child welfare programs. The work that Marcus had dismissed as boring had turned out to be the foundation for dismantling a multi-state criminal enterprise. As I read that letter in my bright new apartment, surrounded by evidence of the life I was building entirely on my own terms, I realized that Marcus had actually given me the greatest gift possible when he announced our divorce at our anniversary party. He had freed me from the exhausting effort of being someone I wasn't in order to maintain a marriage with someone who didn't value who I actually was. The woman he had left was comfortable, accommodating, and desperate for approval from people who would never fully accept her. The woman I had become was powerful, respected, and completely comfortable with the idea that some people's opinions were irrelevant to her happiness and success. Marcus had wanted to trade me for someone more exciting, more emotionally available, more suited to his vision of what his life should look like. Instead, he had lost everything that actually mattered while I gained everything I never knew I wanted. The irony was so perfect that it felt almost scripted, except that real life rarely provides such satisfying examples of justice delivered with mathematical precision. The final twist would come the following week, when I received an unexpected phone call that would complete the transformation from victim to victor in the most surprising way possible. But for that moment, sitting in my apartment with federal recognition of my professional expertise and the knowledge that my work had helped countless vulnerable children, I was content to simply appreciate how far I had traveled from the woman who had worn an emerald dress to her own humiliation just 4 months earlier. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing grant applications in my new office at the Oregon Community Foundation. The voice on the other end belonged to someone I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. Thomas Rivera, senior partner at Rivera, Chen and Associates, one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. Rachel, I hope you remember me from the nonprofit law conference in 2019, he began, his tone carrying the careful formality of someone making a business proposition rather than a social call. I've been following your work on the Cascade Therapeutic Solutions case, and I have a proposition that might interest you. Thomas represented a consortium of families whose children had been affected by foster care fraud across multiple states. The criminal case against Kimberly Hayes had exposed a network of similar schemes operating throughout the Pacific Northwest, and the families wanted to pursue civil litigation to recover damages beyond the restitution ordered in the criminal proceeding. We're looking for someone with your expertise to serve as lead consultant on the civil case, Thomas continued. The work would involve analyzing financial records from dozens of organizations, identifying patterns of fraud and misappropriation, and providing expert testimony in what could become the largest civil rights lawsuit in Oregon history. The scope of the opportunity was staggering. We were talking about a class action lawsuit that could potentially recover hundreds of millions of dollars for families who had been damaged by systematic fraud in the foster care system. The consulting fees alone would be more than I had earned in the entire previous year, but more importantly, the work would establish me as the leading expert on institutional fraud and child welfare service. I accepted the position that same day, and within a week I was traveling to Seattle, Denver, and San Francisco to interview families whose lives had been disrupted by fraudulent organizations, similar to Cascade Therapeutic Solutions. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Children who had remained in foster care longer than necessary because fake therapy programs failed to provide actual reunification services. Families who had been separated based on the recommendations of unqualified counselors, teenagers who had aged out of the system without receiving the transitional support they had been promised. But it was during my third week of research that I discovered the connection that would make this case historically significant. While reviewing financial records from a therapy organization in Seattle, I found wire transfers that traced back to a consulting company owned by Derek Walsh, Marcus's business partner and closest friend. The transactions showed that Derek had been receiving payments for business development services from multiple organizations that were later revealed to be fraudulent. The timing of the payments coincided with his recommendations of these same organizations to city agencies and nonprofit boards where he served as a consultant. Derek Walsh had been taking kickbacks for steering public contracts to fraudulent organizations, creating a corruption network that extended far beyond individual therapy practices. The revelation hit me like lightning. Derek Walsh had been sitting beside Marcus during my presentation at the Oregon Community Foundation, probably calculating his own exposure rather than supporting his friend through a difficult moment. The nervous energy I had attributed to concern for Marcus's situation had actually been the anxiety of someone realizing that his own criminal activities were about to be exposed. More damaging was the realization that Derek's corruption directly implicated Marcus's construction company. Many of the building contracts that Derek had helped Marcus secure were funded by the same grants that had been defrauded by organizations like Cascade Therapeutic Solutions. Marcus might not have known about Kimberly's criminal activities, but he had almost certainly benefited financially from Derek's kickback scheme. I spent the next 48 hours methodically documenting the connections between Derek's consulting payments and Marcus's construction contract. The pattern was unmistakable. Every major project that Marcus had won in the past 3 years had been recommended by agencies or organizations that Derek was receiving illegal payments to influence. The total value of the contracts was over $12 million. Meaning that Marcus's entire recent business success had been built on his partner's corruption. Even if Marcus had been genuinely unaware of Derek's activities, the law required disgorgement of any profits earned through illegal means. Marcus would be required to repay every dollar he had earned from corrupted contracts, effectively bankrupting both his business and his personal finance. But the most delicious irony was yet to come. Among Derek's consulting clients was the Oregon Community Foundation itself, where he had been paid substantial fees to recommend organizations for foster care funding. Derek Walsh had been in the audience during my presentation not as Marcus's friend, but as someone who had been receiving illegal payments to recommend fraudulent organizations for the very grants I was discussing. The FBI was extremely interested in this new information, and within a week of my report, Derek Walsh was arrested on charges of corruption, money laundering, and conspiracy. His arrest made the front page of every major newspaper in Oregon, with particular attention paid to his business partnership with Marcus Thompson, the man who left his wife for an accused fraudster. Marcus's second round of legal troubles began immediately. Federal investigators seized all financial records from his construction company, froze his business accounts pending the corruption investigation, and required him to post a bond to prevent him from liquidating assets that might need to be forfeited as proceeds of illegal activity. The man who had announced our divorce with such confidence just 6 months earlier was now facing the possibility of federal charges, business bankruptcy, and the loss of every asset he had accumulated during our marriage. The comfortable life he had been so eager to escape in order to pursue excitement with Kimberly Hayes had turned into a legal nightmare that threatened to destroy everything he had spent decades building. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Marcus's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss my knowledge of his business practices and financial arrangements with Derek Walsh. The lawyer wanted to know if I would be willing to provide testimony that Marcus had been unaware of his partner's illegal activities, essentially asking me to serve as a character witness for the man who had humiliated me at our anniversary party. I agreed to the meeting out of curiosity more than any desire to help Marcus, and we arranged to meet at a downtown coffee shop that had been one of our regular date night locations during happier times. The symbolism was probably lost on him, but sitting across from Marcus in a place where we had once planned our future together felt like the perfect setting for this final conversation. Marcus looked like he had aged years in the months since our divorce was finalized. His hair was graying at the temples, his face was drawn with stress, and his hands trembled slightly as he stirred sugar into coffee he probably couldn't taste. The confident businessman who had traded me for a more exciting life had been replaced by someone who looked haunted by the consequences of his choices. "I need you to know that I never had any idea what Derek was doing," he began, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who had already told this story many times without being believed. "I thought our success was based on good work and competitive bidding. I had no idea that Derek was taking kickbacks or that our contracts were connected to any kind of fraud." I studied his face while he spoke, looking for signs of deception or calculation, but seeing only exhaustion and genuine fear. Marcus had always been a terrible liar, and his current story had the ring of truth even if it also demonstrated a level of willful ignorance that was professionally inexcusable. "The FBI seems to think you should have noticed unusual patterns in your contract awards," I said, genuinely curious about his explanation. $12 million in projects over 3 years, all recommended by agencies that Derek was secretly consulting for. "That's a remarkable coincidence for someone who claims to have had no suspicions." Marcus's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his situation was physically crushing him. I was distracted. The marriage was falling apart. I was spending all my emotional energy on therapy and trying to figure out what was wrong with my life. I let Derek handle the business development side because I trusted him, and because I was too wrapped up in personal problems to pay attention to where our contracts were coming from. The admission was both pathetic and revealing. Marcus had been so focused on his manufactured marital crisis and his affair with Kimberly that he had ignored warning signs that should have been obvious to any competent business. His midlife crisis had blinded him to his partner's criminal activities and left him vulnerable to prosecution for crimes he might not have actively participated in, but had certainly benefited from. "So you're asking me to testify that you were too distracted by your affair to notice that your business partner was running a criminal enterprise," I said, tasting the irony of the situation. "You want me to tell federal investigators that destroying our marriage was so consuming that it prevented you from fulfilling your fiduciary duties as a business owner?" The color drained from Marcus's face as he processed the implications of what I had just said. His defense strategy required him to admit that his betrayal of our marriage had been so complete and overwhelming that it had rendered him incapable of managing his professional responsibility. He would have to publicly acknowledge that leaving me for Kimberly had been the decision that ultimately destroyed every other aspect of his life. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I did to you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm asking anyway, because you're the only person who can corroborate that I was genuinely distracted during the period when Derek was taking those payments. You're the only one who knows how consumed I was with our marriage problem." The request was so perfectly ironic that I almost laughed. Marcus wanted me to save him from federal prosecution by testifying that his affair with a criminal had been so emotionally demanding that it prevented him from noticing his partner's criminal activity. He wanted me to provide an alibi based on the very betrayal that had destroyed our marriage. "I'll consider it," I said, which was more than he deserved but less than he needed. "But first I want you to understand something about the position you've put yourself in." I leaned forward across the small table, close enough that he couldn't avoid making eye contact. 6 months ago you announced our divorce at our anniversary party because you wanted everyone to know that you had found someone more exciting than your boring wife. You humiliated me publicly because you thought it was the price you had to pay for your new happiness." Marcus nodded miserably, probably wishing he could disappear rather than sit through this accounting of his choices and their consequences. "Now you're facing federal charges, business bankruptcy, and social exile because the exciting woman you chose was a criminal and the trusted partner you relied on was stealing from foster children. Everything you thought was wrong with our marriage turned out to be the only stable thing in your life, and you threw it away for people who were using you in ways you were too arrogant to recognize." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone and consequences that couldn't be avoided. Marcus had gambled everything on the assumption that he could trade his comfortable life for something more fulfilling, and the gamble had cost him everything he actually valued. "I'll testify on your behalf," I said finally, and watched relief flood his features like water into a desert. "Not because you deserve my help, but because the truth is that you were exactly as naive and distracted as you claimed to be. You were so busy destroying our marriage that you didn't notice your business partner was destroying vulnerable family." The testimony I eventually provided to federal investigators was factual, detailed, and ultimately helpful to Marcus's defense. I confirmed that he had been emotionally and mentally consumed by his affair during the period when Derek's corruption was most active, and that his lack of attention to business details was consistent with his behavior during our marriage crisis. Marcus avoided federal charges, though he was required to forfeit every dollar he had earned from Derek's corrupted contracts. His business went bankrupt, his social standing never recovered, and his relationship with Kimberly had obviously ended when she was sentenced to federal prison. The comfortable life he had been so eager to escape was gone forever, replaced by financial struggle and social isolation that would probably last for years. But the most fitting conclusion came a year later when I was keynote speaker at the National Conference on Nonprofit Accountability, delivering a presentation about institutional fraud to an audience of foundation executives, government officials, and nonprofit leaders from across the country. The work that had begun with exposing Kimberly Hayes had evolved into a national platform for reforming oversight systems and protecting vulnerable populations from predatory organizations. As I looked out at the audience of people who now knew my name and respected my expertise, I realized that Marcus had actually given me the greatest gift possible when he chose to humiliate me at our anniversary party. His betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and pursue opportunities I never would have considered if I had remained safely married to someone who saw my potential as boring administrative work. The woman he had left was desperate for approval and willing to diminish herself to maintain relationships with people who didn't value her contribution. The woman I had become was nationally recognized for expertise that saved vulnerable children and held powerful institutions accountable for their stewardship of public resources. Marcus had traded 8 years of marriage for 6 months with a criminal, while I had traded the exhausting effort of being someone I wasn't for the satisfaction of becoming exactly who I was meant to be. Looking back, it was the most favorable exchange of my entire life, and I owed it all to his spectacular failure of judgment on what should have been our most important anniversary. The irony was so perfect that it felt like justice delivered by someone with a sense of humor and an appreciation for poetic endings. Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved, and so had I. The difference was that what I deserved turned out to be everything I had never dared to imagine for myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.